I was I was looking at an ad campaign recently. It was from 2020 for the Equinox gym chain.
Oh, right, the really intense fitness ones.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. And this one featured this incredibly lavish, like high fashion retelling of mythological figures.
Okay, color me intrigued.
Right. So there's this poster of a powerful looking woman just effortlessly lifting two men. And another one shows a man on a funeral days surrounded by these frantic worshipers.
Wow.
But the commercial for it is what really caught my attention because it retells the myth of Narcissus.
Okay, the guy who falls in love with his own reflection.
Right, and he drowns. Like, usually we think of Narcissus as a warning about vanity, you know?
Cautionary tale.
Exactly. But in this version, the narrator looks right at the camera and asks, does that not make self-obsession the most selfless act of all?
Oh, wow. They just completely flipped it on its head.
Totally.
Instead of, warning about the dangers of ego, they're framing self-obsession as the ultimate aspiration.
Which feels like it perfectly captures this very modern, almost, mandatory obsession we all seem to have with becoming our best selves.
It really does.
And that brings us to the mission for you today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're exploring a fascinating stack of historical research, specifically drawing from Tara Isabella Burton's work, self-made to answer one massive question for you.
And it is a big one.
It is. We want to know, how did humanity shift from believing that our identities were strictly assigned by God and the social hierarchy to believing that we're the divine creators of our own destinies?
Yeah, and it's a massive transition. To understand it, we really have to look at the underlying mechanics.
Right.
Because the core shift isn't that society simply woke up one day, discarded religion, and became entirely secular.
It wasn't just an overnight thing.
No, not at all. The process was much more subtle. What actually happened is that we relocated the concept of the divine.
Relocated it.
Yeah, we took it out of the heavens, out of that rigid medieval cosmic order, and we placed it directly into our own personal desires and ambitions.
So we didn't stop believing in a creator.
Exactly. We just slowly decided that the creator was, well, us.
I want to spend some time unpacking that because exploring this source material is going to take us into some really unexpected places.
It really is a wild ride.
Yeah, we are going to look at the workshops of Renaissance painters, the exclusive parties of Regency London, 19th century American lecture halls, and the laboratories of the Gilded Age.
A real historical world tour.
Right. We're tracking down exactly how the concept of the self-made man was constructed. But I'm stuck on something right at the beginning here.
What's that?
Well, before anyone could start hacking their identity, someone had to realize it was actually possible to step outside that medieval order in the first place.
Which was incredibly difficult to conceptualize at the time. I mean, in the medieval mindset, you were born a peasant, a bishop, or a king.
You just were what you were.
Exactly. That was your fixed place in a holistic, divinely ordered universe. To try and change your social station wasn't just ambitious, it was almost nonsensical.
Like trying to change gravity.
Basically, yeah. It would be like trying to change the fact that an oak tree is an oak tree. Your identity was a fact of nature, dictated from above.
But then that rigid structure starts to crack, and one of the first major fractures we see in the research is with Albrecht Dürer in the 16th century Renaissance.
Ah, yes, Dürer.
Yeah, so Dürer was a German painter and printmaker, born the son of a middle-class goldsmith. Yet he became so famous that when he died, an obsessive fan literally sneaked into his funeral and sliced off a lock of his hair to keep as a holy relic.
That is wild.
Right. Dürer was essentially inventing personal branding before the printing press was even fully mainstream. I mean, he painted 13 self-portraits where he is just luxuriating in his own image.
He really loved himself.
He did. He's wearing aristocratic furs that legally he had no birthright to wear.
And that level of self-focus was completely unprecedented. Prior to this, medieval artists were largely anonymous craftsmen.
Right, they weren't signing their names in big letters.
No, their job was to reflect God's glory through their art, not to draw attention to themselves.
But in his most famous self-portrait, painted in the year 1500, he pushes this to an absolute extreme. Dürer paints himself facing straight on.
Which is a huge deal.
Right, because at the time, that specific direct pose was exclusively reserved for depictions of Jesus Christ.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He paints his hair a dark hazelnut to match forged eyewitness accounts of Jesus's coloring. He even raises his fingers in a traditional blessing pose.
He's fully cosplaying as the savior.
Exactly. But instead of using the traditional letters for Jesus Christ, he uses his own initials. AD.
Ah, of course.
Yeah, it stood for Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, but also Albrecht Dürer. He was basically stamping reality with his own watermark.
He was. But, this creates a massive theological problem for Renaissance society.
Oh, so?
Well, you have these low-born upstarts like Dürer or Leonardo da Vinci, who was the illegitimate son of a peasant, who are clearly doing extraordinary things.
Well, they're undeniably talented.
Yeah, so how does society explain their spectacular rise without completely shattering the idea of a God-ordered universe?
I was actually wondering about that. If medieval society was so strict about God's order, how did a middle-class painter equating himself to Christ not immediately get burned at the stake for heresy?
Because society invented a theological loophole.
A loophole?
Yeah, the concept of the genius. Now, the word originally meant a guardian spirit, but it was adapted to describe a person who was essentially a modern demigod, favored directly by the divine.
Oh.
Yeah, it provided a really convenient explanation. You weren't breaking God's rules by rising above your station. You were just one of nature's bastards, operating on a higher preordained frequency.
So your extraordinary talent was proof that God had made an exception just for you.
Exactly.
But introducing a loophole like that seems incredibly dangerous.
Oh, it definitely was.
I mean, if genius is supposedly innate, but it comes with immense social rewards, doesn't that immediately create a market for people who aren't geniuses to just, well, start faking it?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the mechanism of how this new identity was performed.
The sources point to a handbook from 1528 by Baldassare Castiglione called The Courtier, and it reads like the original fake-it-till-you-make-it playbook for the upwardly mobile.
It really is.
Castiglione introduces this concept of sprezzatura, which translates to a sort of studied nonchalance.
It's the art of concealing your art.
What do you mean?
Think about it. If you looked like you were trying too hard to be cultured or graceful, it proved you weren't a natural genius.
You were just a striving peasant.
Exactly. So Castiglione advised his readers to work incredibly hard behind closed doors so they could make everything look completely effortless in public.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Lying, or at least meticulously curating a public illusion, became an integral part of self-making. You had to convince the aristocracy that you were one of the chosen few.
It's exactly like people today spending 2 hours doing their makeup just to achieve the no makeup, I woke up like this look.
That is a perfect comparison.
But there's a massive vulnerability in building a society on faking it. Eventually, someone is going to realize that if the rules of society can be manipulated, they probably aren't divine at all. They're just made up.
Precisely. And that dangerous realization is the psychological engine that drives us right into the Enlightenment.
We see this shift really clearly with the French philosopher Montaigne in the late 16th century.
Montaigne is fascinating here.
He really is. He gets obsessed with a seemingly simple question. Why on earth do humans wear clothes?
Which sounds like a weird question, but it's actually huge.
Exactly, because to understand why this matters, we have to talk about sumptuary laws.
Right?
These were literal legal codes that made it a crime to wear certain fabrics, like silk or velvet, if you weren't born into the corresponding social class.
So your identity was legally enforced by your wardrobe.
Yes. But Montaigne looks at indigenous populations in the New World, he looks at animals, and he concludes that these strict social rules are just arbitrary custom.
They're made up.
Right. They're accidents of history, not divine mandates.
And that realization becomes the absolute powder keg for the Enlightenment era.
It really blows things up.
It does. The philosopher Immanuel Kant talked about this as cutting the leading strings, the strings that a parent uses to guide a toddler.
Okay, yeah.
The goal of the Enlightenment was to sever the ties of custom, religion, and the absolute monarchy, because humanity had finally reached intellectual adulthood.
So authenticity now meant stripping away all of society's arbitrary expectations.
Exactly. Instead of a god in the heavens or a king on a throne dictating who you were, nature and your own inner feelings became the ultimate authorities.
Before we go further into the consequences of this, I think we need to pause for a second.
Good idea.
Because we are about to touch on some highly charged, deeply uncomfortable historical philosophies, and I want to make it absolutely clear to you, the listener, that we are simply unpacking the historical arguments that Burton lays out in the source material.
Right. We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing these viewpoints, whether it's the justification of violence, extreme inequality, or systemic oppression. Our goal is strictly to impartially report on the ideas that were used to rationalize behavior during these eras.
And that context is so crucial because this idea of absolute inner authority was taken to terrifying extremes.
It really was.
While many philosophers used this new freedom to argue for democratic political liberation, Others saw a much darker, logical conclusion.
Which brings us to the Marquis de Sade.
Right.
He was a French aristocrat who wrote these infamous, highly graphic novels like Justine, and he wrote most of them while imprisoned for real-life acts of violence.
He was not a good guy.
Not at all. In Sade's worldview, his characters commit horrific, brutal acts not just for gratification, but as a deliberate form of self-expression.
Intense.
It's a violent rebuke to a god he believes doesn't exist. It's basically evil just for the sake of originality.
And what the sources highlight about Sade is how he exposes the real shadow side of self-creation. Well, if your inner desires are the only true moral authority, you inherently divide humanity into two distinct groups.
Okay, what are the groups?
On one side, you have the libertines, those who act as godlike creators, shaping reality to their will. And on the other side, you have the herd, who are merely the raw material or victims for the creator's vision.
That is incredibly bleak.
It is. To be truly original, in this extreme aristocratic view, required a person to aggressively transgress against normal morality, simply to prove they weren't part of the mediocre masses.
So self-making in this specific iteration literally requires an underclass to define itself against.
Sadly, yes.
And we see the mechanics of that superiority complex transform into social currency as we move into Regency-era England.
Oh, this is a huge shift.
Yeah, let's look at July 1813 at the exclusive Argyle Street rooms in London. Beau Brummell, who is the grandson of a boarding house proprietor, is hosting a lavish party.
And Brummell is quite the character.
He really is. So the Prince Regent, the future King George I, shows up. Now, Brummell and the Prince have had a falling out. Lots of drama. The Prince greets everyone in the receiving line, but deliberately ignores Brummell. But Brummell doesn't back down.
What does he do?
He turns to a friend in front of the entire room and loudly asks, "Who's your fat friend?"
I mean, it is just an unthinkable level of insolence to speak to the de facto ruler of the British Empire that way.
It's crazy.
The question is, how did a middle-class upstart possess the social capital to publicly humiliate royalty?
That's what I couldn't wrap my head around. But the sources explain that Brummell had absolute cultural power. He was basically the prototype for the modern influencer.
The original influencer.
Totally. If he started wearing a beaver hat, everyone copied him, to the point that he single-handedly caused a beaver population drop in North America.
That is a staggering amount of influence.
Right. But his power wasn't based on being flamboyant. It was based on projecting an aura of absolute boredom, this sort of glacial indifference.
While secretly trying very hard.
Exactly. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, he spent 3 hours a day bathing in milk and discarding dozens of slightly imperfectly tied cravats.
To understand why society tolerated and even worshipped Brummell, we can use a really helpful analogy from the text. Think of it like inflation, but for culture.
Okay, inflation for culture.
Yeah, we are in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. Colonial trade is bringing immense wealth into London. Suddenly, anyone with money, the new merchant class, can afford to buy luxury silks, bright colors, and exotic spices.
Right.
When the visual markers of wealth can be endlessly printed by factories and bought by anyone, their social value drops to zero.
I see. If you're an aristocrat, you can't just wear expensive clothes anymore to prove you're better than a merchant, because the merchant is wearing the exact same clothes.
Exactly. So the aristocratic class, guided by dandies like Brummell, had to invent a new currency that factories couldn't print.
And what was that?
They created the concept of bon ton, an aristocracy as style. It was a minimalist, invisible grace.
Invisible grace.
Yeah. If the average person on the street turned around to admire your outfit, you were considered poorly dressed because you were trying too hard.
Wow.
By establishing rules of style that were entirely subjective and impossible to define, they maintained their dominance through pure aesthetic snobbery.
Think about how you feel when you see quiet luxury trending on your feed today.
Oh, yes.
The ultra-wealthy wearing unbranded $2,000 beige sweaters. It's the exact same mechanism Brummell invented. It uses invisible style rules to make you feel like an outsider.
It really hasn't changed.
But while Europe was obsessing over this aesthetic exclusion, America was facing a completely different challenge. They were a new nation trying to define what success meant without a traditional aristocracy.
Which forces a massive shift in the narrative. We move from an aesthetic model of self-making to a profoundly moral one.
We see this so clearly in October 1859 when Frederick Douglass delivers his famous self-made men speech in a Philadelphia lecture hall.
Such a powerful speech.
It is. Douglass completely rejects the European idea of innate genius or inexplicable grace. He tells the crowd that the real secret to being self-made is simply work. He literally says work, work, work.
The American liberal tradition democratized the idea of self-creation.
Right.
The narrative shifted to say that the self is essentially a wild landscape. It needs to be disciplined, cultivated, and optimized.
So it's about effort, not innate style.
Exactly. The heroes of this era, like Abraham Lincoln or Benjamin Franklin, were celebrated not for their style, but for their civic virtue, frugality, and relentless self-control.
It was incredibly systematic, too. Benjamin Franklin created a literal ledger for his 13 virtues.
A literal spreadsheet of morality.
Basically, he drew columns and rows, and every time he failed at a virtue like temperance or frugality, he'd mark it with a red ink spot.
Wow.
He gamified his own morality, like a habit tracking app today. But I'm having a hard time squaring this narrative with the reality of the era.
Oh.
Well, if the cultural consensus says that literally anyone can become self-made with enough elbow grease, doesn't that inherently mean that poverty or failure is viewed as a deliberate choice?
It does, and that is the dark corollary of the American dream. And again, tracking with the historical analysis Burton provides, we have to look at how this logic was weaponized.
Right.
If success is entirely earned through hard work, then the logical conclusion of that era was that poverty is a moral defect. The sources detail how this specific ideology coexisted with and was heavily utilized to rationalize some of the darkest chapters of American history.
Because if you view the self as land to be cultivated, that logic scales up dangerously.
Exactly. The narrative of self-cultivation provided an ideological rationalization for colonial expansion and chattel slavery.
Which is horrifying.
It is. The argument was that those who supposedly lacked this specific Western brand of ingenuity or industriousness were essentially moral children.
So they needed to be managed.
That was the rationalization, yes. They were deemed unfit for self-governance, and therefore their subjection was rationalized by those in power as a natural order. The promise that anyone can make themselves inherently breeds a profound contempt for those who supposedly didn't try hard enough.
And as we move into the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, that moral imperative of hard work mutates again.
It definitely takes a turn.
It stops being about virtuous frugality and turns into a mass market obsession with manifesting millions. We start to see public relations and hype become just as important, if not more important, than the actual work.
This is where the definition of value in society fundamentally changes. The virtuous citizen is replaced by the capitalist entrepreneur.
Look at Thomas Edison. In 1878, he promises the press he has perfected the incandescent light bulb.
But he hadn't, right?
He hadn't. The filament kept melting after a few minutes, so he invites journalists into his Menlo Park lab for a private demonstration, turns the bulb on, lets them marvel at it, and then swiftly shoos them out of the room before the bulb burns out.
That is just blatant PR manipulation.
Right. He essentially lied to keep his funding and his reputation intact. And then you have P.T. Barnum, who openly praised the magic of what he called humbug.
Barnum was the master of hype.
He was. He convinced a guy named Genin to buy the first outrageously expensive ticket to an opera concert just to get his name in the papers.
Just for the clout.
Exactly. It was a manufactured viral sensation, and Genin ended up selling 10,000 extra hats because of the publicity.
But the critical question is why Gilded Age society was suddenly so eager to accept and reward this kind of deceit.
Yeah, why were they okay with it?
The mechanism behind this acceptance was a unique blend of science and spirituality.
Right. How did they justify this aggressive capitalism as something spiritual?
Well, through two major ideological movements. First, you had social Darwinism, promoted by figures like Herbert Spencer.
Okay.
They took Charles Darwin's theories of biological evolution and incorrectly applied them to human economics. They argued that millionaires were quite literally the product of natural selection.
Survival of the fittest, but for business.
Exactly. Aiding the poor, under this logic, was defying the laws of nature.
Which was incredibly convenient for the robber barons. John D. Rockefeller taught Sunday school, and the sources note he literally told his students that the growth of a massive business monopoly is just the survival of the fittest.
It's wild that he taught that in a church.
I know. He compared his monopoly to an American beauty rose, saying it can only grow into its full splendor by sacrificing and snipping off the early buds that grow up around it.
It's a ruthless economic philosophy dressed up as a biological law.
Truly.
And this was paired with the New Thought movement, which is the direct ancestor of today's manifestation culture.
Okay, how did that work?
New Thought argued that a person's inner thoughts literally emitted magnetic currents that could attract wealth and cure disease.
Wait, literal magnetic currents?
Yes, So if you were rich, it wasn't just because you worked hard, it was because your internal divine energy was vibrating at a higher frequency. External wealth became the ultimate proof of internal divine favor.
Which means if you are poor, your thoughts are just vibrating poorly.
Right.
It's a brutal system. But while America is fully embracing this mass market capitalism, the hustle, and the rise of department store consumerism, the European self-makers are watching this happen, and they recoil in absolute horror.
They hated it.
They really did. They retreat into a world of total artificiality.
Which brings us to fin de siècle Europe, the end of the 19th century, where the reaction against democratized identity reaches its peak.
In 1892, Oscar Wilde starts a massive craze in London. He tells his followers to wear arsenic-dyed green carnations to the premiere of a play.
Just completely out of nowhere.
Yeah, and everyone in society is whispering, trying to figure out what it means, and Wilde's response is brilliant. He says nothing whatsoever, but that is just what nobody will guess.
Classic Oscar Wilde, but there's a reason for it. Wilde and the European dandies were reacting against what they called la foule, the crowd, or the mob. Remember our inflation analogy from earlier? Now, it wasn't just the merchant class buying luxury goods. Cities were exploding in population, and department stores meant that mass-produced, identical goods were available to millions of people.
So to the dandy, a democratized world where everyone has access to the same things is just terrifyingly bland.
Precisely. To stand out from the mob, they embraced extreme originality. They worshipped the unnatural and the artificial.
Like dyeing a flower green with arsenic.
Exactly. They deliberately played with transgression and sexual fluidity because those were things the factories couldn't mass produce. It was the defense mechanism to definitively prove they were not part of the bourgeois herd.
And you can see how deeply they feared ordinary people when you look at their literature.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources bring up a chilling detail from this era. Late 19th century dandy writers became absolutely obsessed with the trope of the automaton, or the robot, which was often depicted as female.
Right.
They didn't view ordinary people as fellow humans trying to participate in modern life. They viewed them as literal, unthinking machines.
Because a machine just follows a script. It doesn't create.
Right, it just repeats.
So if the American model suggested that everyone possessed the capacity to be a self-maker, the European dandy model pushed back by insisting that most people were essentially non-playable characters, barely human at all.
Let's take a step back and look at the whole arc we've traced today for our listener.
It's been quite the journey.
It has. We started with Albrecht Dürer's signature in the Renaissance, where the desire to be self-made was a desperate attempt to transcend a rigid medieval world by claiming the loophole of genius.
And then we saw that evolve during the Enlightenment into a tool for philosophical liberation, cutting the strings of custom, even if it led to the terrifying extremes of the Marquis de Sade.
From there, we watched it transform into the invisible rules of bon ton in Regency England, where style became a weapon of exclusion.
Then it crossed the ocean to become the moral backbone of the American dream, where hard work was equated with worth of logic that was subsequently used to justify severe inequality.
Finally, we saw it mutate into the mass market manifestation of the Gilded Age, prompting the European dandies to retreat into extreme artificiality just to avoid looking like robots.
And through all of these different eras and iterations, whether it's Dürer painting himself as Christ, Ben Franklin meticulously tracking his virtues in a ledger, or the new thought gurus promising you can attract wealth with magnetic currents, one core assumption remains exactly the same.
And what's that?
The underlying belief is always that your personal desires, your ambitions, and your curated image are the truest, most authentic parts of who you are.
That is the defining legacy of this history, isn't it? We have fully internalized the idea that we are the authors of our own reality.
We really have. It's built into how we see the world now.
Which brings us back to where we started, looking at that Equinox ad.
Right, the Narcissus flip.
Today, you are constantly told to build your personal brand. You're told to manifest your success. You're told by every algorithm and influencer on your feed to be authentic and become your best self.
It's inescapable.
But looking at the mechanics of this history, it leaves you with a really uncomfortable question to mull over.
What's the question?
When we are meticulously curating our identities for public consumption, tweaking our profiles and tracking our habits to optimize our lives, are we actually liberating ourselves?
That is the big question.
Or are we just blindly following a 500-year-old script, risking becoming the very automatons we are trying so desperately not to be?
It's a complex legacy to navigate, and it certainly reframes how we think about authenticity. simplicity.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll see you next time.